January 1919, in the Hall of Mirrors at the Palace of Versailles. 3 months after the end of the First World War, the victorious powers, the United States, Great Britain, and France, ready themselves to manage the future of a Europe in ruins. They all agree on one thing: Germany, the country that started the war, must be punished. And it was above all France that would insist on obtaining particularly harsh sanctions. Invaded on 2 occasions in 1870 and 1914, the French were traumatized by their powerful neighbor.
In 1918, it was the victor who was afraid of the vanquished. The great obsession was the return of the German threat.
What had to be avoided at all costs was putting ourselves in a situation where we could once more be threatened by Germany, the neighbor whose territory had not been invaded. That was the object of the Versailles Peace Treaty negotiations.
The treaty stipulated that Germany alone was responsible for the war. Under the surveillance of an international commission, Germany's arsenal was to be destroyed piece by piece, and its last fortifications razed to the ground.
Germany is forbidden from having any aircraft for military purposes. It can't have any tanks. Its naval forces are reduced to virtually nothing. So it's really essentially disarmed. And the aim is to try and keep things like that.
All the treaty allowed Germany for its protection was a little army of 100,000 men. And above all, Germany must pay exorbitant war reparations to France. The unintended consequences of the Versailles Treaty was to sow the seeds of a future conflict between France and Germany. And if France wanted peace, it had to prepare itself, one way or another, for war. At the price of enormous effort and immense human and material losses, France had recovered its former territories of Alsace and Lorraine. Now this new German frontier had to be protected.
France had won the war. Of course, this was very important for the country, but at the same time, it was exhausted. What's more, the French knew they didn't win this war alone, but with the Belgians and the British. And in truth, nobody had the heart for another fight.
The watchword at that time was never again. Throughout the 1920s, discussions continued and ideas were debated about how to protect ourselves from a German invasion.
Self-protection, but without engaging in a new conflict. Without fighting. To solve this dilemma, the French military staff analyzed the 4 years of World War I. Between the trenches, the airplanes, and the tanks, which armaments and which strategies had worked best?
The conclusion, and everyone agreed on this, was the resistance of fortified lines, lines of trenches, positions. Everyone agreed, more or less, on the idea that a modern system of defense had to rely on a defensive line, a barrier, a major barrier.
This meant fortifications. The forts of Verdun, had they not enabled the French army to repulse the German assault in 1916 and snatch victory? For part, at least, of the military staff, this was the line to follow.
Before the Battle of Verdun, the French had ceased believing that fortifications provided an effective defense. The result was that the renowned Fort Douaumont was not even defended. The Germans entered it without any problem. Of course, the French quickly realized they'd made a mistake. And in the end, it was thanks to these forts that the French managed to stop the German offensive. This enabled them to appreciate the true value of these fortifications.
Verdun is an important symbol for the French. And the idea became widespread after the war that, thanks to these kinds of fortifications, they shall not pass. And all the strategy post-1918 was concentrated on making lots of little Verduns.
Result, for France, the defensive option that gave the key role to frontier fortifications gained ground. The French decided not to develop their arsenals of offensive weapons such as tanks and planes. A decision that was to have disastrous consequences. On the other side of the Rhine, Germany was limited in its military options by the Versailles Treaty. The commander of the little army of 100,000 men supposed to protect the country was Hans von Seeckt. For the German military, the Versailles Treaty was not only humiliating, but also dangerous for the security of their country.
During the Weimar Republic years, the German military was faced with an impossible task: defend their country's long borders with a minuscule army and without the right to build fortifications.
The only possible option for the German military staff, a mobile army. But how were they to get around the ban on producing weapons? In his search for a solution, Hans von Seeckt turned to an unlikely partner, the Soviet Union.
The principle was as follows. The Germans shared their technical know-how, which was extremely developed at that time, while the Soviets gave them the opportunity to test their inventions inside their territory. Together, they would create a chemical weapons school and a tank and aviation school. This collaboration enabled the Germans to maintain their technological advance in the armaments field.
Far from the international observers, the Germans started developing and testing new weapons with complete impunity. In collaboration with the Soviet Union, modern warfare was born. Meanwhile, in Paris, the idea of a purely defensive military doctrine was definitively adopted. Demographic problems, as well as the pacifism of French society, encouraged the politicians to take that course.
Instead of putting pressure on Germany, the priority was normalizing relations with Germany. The French thought they could attain the goal of peace by other means, and in 1927, the Prime Minister of that time declared that France will no longer declare war against anybody.
It was time to put into place the military reforms the military staff had been talking about for 10 years. Their main tool, a giant defense line running from the Atlantic to the Italian Alps. Its particularity was to have fortified zones in strategic areas, at the German border and in the Alps next to Italy. This defense line would bear the name of the Minister of War, Maginot.
A fortification system of whatever kind is a means of protecting your men, but also of enabling them to fight under favorable conditions. The fortifications were to permit France to mobilize its army while protecting its rich industrial regions. Alsace and Lorraine, essentially.
In drawing up plans for giant bunkers, the military were guided by their experiences during the First World War. They analyzed in particular the weak points and strong points of the Verdun forts.
The French officers looked at the damage inflicted on the French forts at Verdun, which were huge blocks of concrete, and realized that they had even been damaged by shells that had missed but fallen nearby.
How, then, could they build forts that would better resist shelling? It was the Metz fort, built by the Germans, that would supply the answer. Situated on French soil since 1918, French engineers studied the Metz fortifications and discovered some crucial differences with Verdun. Instead of a fortress built in one block, the engineers discovered a structure dispersed over a much wider area with bunkers linked to the fortified barracks by underground tunnels.
The advantage is that you can place the different elements of the fortified group in ideal positions. The observation posts, for example, are placed in advanced positions to enable maximum visibility. The large and medium cannon can be hidden behind a hill because their firing angle can be adjusted. You can therefore spread out all these elements according to the terrain and link them with underground corridors. You can even build your barracks at a distance in a well-protected place.
On the Maginot Line, it was this fort architecture that would inspire the engineers to create veritable fortresses. One of these was Schönenberg Ouvrage. Situated in the north of Alsace, 9 kilometers from the German border, it was part of the Lauter fortified region. The fortress comprised 8 bunkers of differing sizes and functions. In front, 6 combat bunkers buried in the hill.
Calculations were made to protect against all the bombs and shells used at that time, including the German big guns and their 420mm shells. We needed a minimum of 15 to 16 meters of earth.
Each one of these artillery bunkers was equipped with an observation cupola and turrets sheltering different artillery pieces. Amongst them, the 75mm field gun, the famous French 75. This was the Maginot Line's weapon of choice. Here at the Schonenberg fortress, the French 75 was mounted in bunkers 3 and 4 beneath an eclipse gun turret.
The emblematic image of the Maginot Line is the eclipse gun turret, the one that rises and descends and does a 360-degree turn. 150 of them were built. There were other fortifications around the world with pivoting turrets, but not ones that went up and down. It was electromechanical. It was a counterweight to help raise the turret, which meant that a child could lift a 100-ton turret with no problem at all.
The French 75s could fire 30 times a minute or once every 2 seconds. Their maximum range was around 9,500 meters.
Artillery fortifications are, for me, war factories. And the Maginot Line soldiers had to be highly skilled workers to operate these very sophisticated armaments.
In these combat bunkers, the men were protected by reinforced concrete 6 meters thick. 150,000 tons of reinforced concrete were used to build Ouvrage Schonenberg alone.
It was the first time in France that the decision had been taken to spend money on protecting human beings. André Maginot said that a wall of concrete was less expensive than a wall of young soldiers.
Over a kilometer away, 2 other bunkers out of sight, hidden in the forest. The ammunition entrance. Rails were laid so that narrow-gauge trains could bring the shells into the fortress. And still more discreet, the entrance of the men. At Ouvrage Schonenberg, there were between 800 and 1,000 soldiers. The bunkers were linked together by corridors sunk 30 meters below ground. They led to the different rooms where everything was provided that was necessary for the daily life of the troops and the correct functioning of the fort. The ammunition entrance and the men's entrance led to the barracks, the kitchen, and the ammunition dump. The ammunition train ran along a 1.5-kilometer-long corridor. This corridor also led to the cable entrance and the command post.
The Maginot Line had its own power station. The corridors leading to the combat bunkers were equipped with cables that brought electricity to the combat bunkers. The air circulating in the whole complex was filtered, which was very important given the experience of gas warfare in 1914. You had telephone switchboards, telegraphs, everything that existed at that time in terms of modern technology could be found in the fortifications of the Maginot Line. When my father and his comrades arrived at the Maginot Line, it felt like they were entering into a world dreamt up by Jules Verne.
In the fortified regions, there were some 150 fort complexes such as Ouvrage Schonenberg. They were the high-tech wonders of their era. In all, 11.4 million tons of concrete were poured into the construction of the Maginot Line. It was the construction project of the century, the pride of the whole of France.
So the Maginot Line, if you like, appeals to the desire to keep the peace in terms of French defence policy. At the same time, there is a defensive mentality among French generals. The whole idea of fast-moving armoured warfare simply doesn't fit into the way they think.
Fortifications don't wage war. They're buildings with guns and men inside. You wage war differently.
From the Belgian border onwards, however, these huge fort complexes were replaced by small country fortifications. It was diplomatically impossible to build big forts here because Belgium was a political and military ally. At the same time, it was in Belgium that the French army believed it would have to fight the Germans if they attacked.
The plan was to say, right, when the war kicks off, we all rush to Belgium and deploy on the Belgian border along our Maginot Line, and then there'll be a real defense line. It was for that reason that we didn't prolong the Maginot Line as far as the North Sea. That decision would cost us very dearly.
The Maginot Line would inspire a number of European countries. Czechoslovakia brought in France's engineers to build its Beneš line, following the same model as its French elder sister. But it wasn't just the Czechs who decided to wall themselves in. The Belgians modernized their forts around Liège, the Poles fortified the Hel Peninsula, and even the Swiss built themselves an anti-tank line that they nicknamed the Toblerone Line.
People were traumatized by the experience of World War I, so they thought, if we wall ourselves in and hide behind our fortifications, then we'll be all right. But in the end, there was also the expression of fear and an incapacity to wage offensive war if that became necessary.
Considered as the solution that would guarantee the peace, defensive retreat became the European consensus. But the continent would soon be shaken out of its comfortable certitudes. One country would spoil the party: Adolf Hitler's Germany. (1933). Adolf Hitler, leader of the National Socialist Party, was elected chancellor. His hate-filled speech found a ready echo in the German population. He promised to avenge Germany for the humiliation of Versailles and restore the greatness of his country.
Already in 1933, Hitler announced to his Wehrmacht generals, "Now you shall rebuild our army so that we can reconquer territories that we shall Germanize. And all of this we are going to do rapidly." It was evident that he was preparing an offensive.
The German armaments factories were put on maximum production. Thanks to the secret cooperation with the Red Army, everything was in place. In 1934, 800 new Panzer I tanks rolled out of the factories. France, whose army had been the most modern in 1918, had fallen behind to an alarming degree.
We had nothing new except the 1924 machine gun, which had been modified in 1929. This was the only new weapon that appeared during those years, next to nothing. While we were building the Maginot Line, we were not building tanks. I believe that in the year 1934, we built 3.
Confronted with a fast rearming Germany, the French government reacted at last. 10 years behind, the production of tanks and planes finally got underway. Too little, too late, for Hitler was already planning his next move. On the 8th of March 1938, Wehrmacht troops occupied the Rhineland. It was a region on the border with France that had been demilitarized and under international mandate since the end of World War I. In violation of the Versailles Treaty, Hitler openly provoked France.
France in particular, the country that was directly threatened, did absolutely nothing. Our weakness was completely exposed.
For Hitler, the absence of any reaction from France was very significant. It showed that his military schemes had an open road before them: wage war in the East in order to gain living space for the German people. But he needed to make sure that France would not put itself in the way of his ambitions.
The German trauma had always been waging war on 2 fronts. The Germans knew that by starting a war in the East, they would have to confront the French and the British in the West. It was an age-old problem.
So to put his plans into action, there remained one more thing to do: build his own defense line along Germany's western frontier. The approach was the opposite of the one that produced the Maginot Line. Instead of protecting the borders in order to preserve the peace, Hitler's fortifications would contribute to his preparations for war. In 1938, the Führer launched the biggest construction project that Germany had ever seen. The project was ambitious, with major and elaborate fortifications linked by underground corridors. It had to equal the Maginot Line. When his engineers presented their plans to Hitler, however, it was a disappointment.
The German fortification specialists had thought up an extremely elaborate design. The trouble was, with the technical means at their disposal at that time, it would have been impossible to complete it before 1952, and that was too late for Hitler.
Hitler fixed new deadlines. 10,000 bunkers would be built in just over 4 months. To bring the completion date forward, he put the Reichs engineer Fritz Todt in charge. Todt had just completed another vast building project, the Reichs Autobahns. He was the man for the job. In order to get the line built faster, he entirely rethought it.
From that moment onwards, bunkers were built like kit houses. Standardized pieces could be used to build a number of different bunker models. A lot of effort was made to rationalize the construction process in order to make it faster, and the buildings became simpler to such a degree that their quality was compromised. In particular, the concrete bunker walls became thinner and thinner.
They made a whole catalogue of what they called Regelbauten, building regulations. In the catalogue, they had the little bunker and the big bunker, the shelter, the infirmary shelter, and so on. And depending on the circumstances, the military would say, yes, I think we'd like a machine gun here or a field gun there. So they'd get out their German Regelbauten catalogue and build. It was all already standardized.
One typical bunker type on the Siegfried Line was the Regelbau 10. This was a shelter for 15 soldiers equipped with 2 machine guns. Its walls were never more than 150 centimeters thick. 3,000 Regelbau 10 were built. It was the most common bunker on the German defense line. The Führer followed the building of the Siegfried Line closely and keenly and involved himself in the design of the fortifications. A veteran of the First World War, he contributed corrections to the Regelbau 10 in particular.
Hitler based his judgment on his own experience as a soldier in the First World War. And he said, when a soldier presents himself at one of his own army's bunkers and has to knock on the door under enemy fire, it's dangerous for him. So Hitler had protection added to the entrances, which made it possible for soldiers to take shelter before knocking at the doors.
Like the French, the Germans would fortify the most vulnerable regions. But they would also use natural obstacles such as rivers and hills, exploiting their defensive potential. The means deployed for the Siegfried Line were enormous. In all, 3.5 million tons of concrete, 7 million tons of sand and gravel, over 1 million tons of cement. 700,000 tons of iron were used for the fabrication of anti-tank defenses alone. The scale of the construction site that ran the entire length of the border was gigantic. Nearly 500,000 men conscripted all across Germany were put to work on the building of 17,000 bunkers in record time.
But when we talk about 17,000 bunkers, it wasn't 17,000 Schonenbergs. For the most part, these were concrete or steel domes containing a single lookout who was sometimes armed with a machine gun. In addition, there were some large bunkers for 5, 8, or 12 men. The large fortified complexes, the ones comparable to those of the Maginot Line that were planned initially, were very low in number.
There were 17,000 bunkers on the Siegfried Line scattered all along the border, compared with 30,000 small, medium, and large fortified constructions on the Maginot Line. But the number of buildings wasn't the only difference between the two opposing systems of defense.
The Maginot Line, built in the 1930s, was the high technology of its time. In the bunkers of the Siegfried Line, on the other hand, there was a manual ventilation system, a telephone attached to the wall, and from time to time heating. In terms of technology, that was it. Electricity was extremely rare in the German bunkers. They used oil lamps for lighting.
The bunker's simplicity had one advantage, though. They didn't require the ultra-specialized soldiers that were needed on the Maginot Line.
In the German bunkers, you could deploy regular Wehrmacht soldiers. They moved in armed with their machine guns and grenades. The instructions were written up on the walls, such as turn off the lights before opening the observation slit. And these same soldiers could also come out of the shelters, carrying their arms, and go on the offensive. The bunkers were just one stage of the battle.
Dahinter steht natürlich die Strategie.
It was a question of strategy. Germany wanted to cancel its defeat in the First World War, while France wanted to preserve its victory gains. Therefore, of course, France sought literally to wall in its acquisitions, while the Germans knew that they had to go on the offensive in order to change things.
Während die Deutschen natürlich wissen, sie müssen angreifen.
Protection versus sacrifice, movement versus immobility. The form of the two defense lines expressed the difference between the German and French military doctrines. But thanks to the propaganda machine, the Nazi regime was able to give its Siegfried Line the advantage.
Mit stolzer Freude begrüßen die Männer vom Westwall ihren Führer bei seinen wiederholten Besuchen im Befestigungsgebiet.
The Führer knew his bunkers were no rivals for the fortresses of the Maginot Line. But that didn't matter. It was enough for people to believe it was true. The Siegfried Line construction site became the decor of one of the biggest propaganda films the Nazi regime ever made. Its aim to make people believe the Germans had real fortresses. And any means might be used to attain that goal.
Presenting the Siegfried Line as a gigantic fortification was doubtless the biggest trick pulled off by this film. In a whole series of sequences, we see, first of all, military architects choosing where to position a bunker. A sign is put up announcing its construction. Then, at the end, we see columns of soldiers entering a giant bunker called number 1238. Except the building was, in reality, elsewhere. They filmed it in order to make us believe that it was on the Siegfried Line. It was a perfect strategy aimed at suggesting that something comparable to the Maginot Line was being built.
Displaying the Reich's military might while reassuring their European neighbors as to their peaceful intentions. The shepherd driving his sheep through the dragon's teeth was the synthesis of the Führer's double message. Screened in all German cinemas, the film was also translated into 14 languages and distributed throughout the world, in France in particular.
I don't think this film made the French trust the Germans anymore. But, at the same time, it suggested to them that their neighbors were pursuing the same policy as them. By building a fortified line, the Germans gave the impression they were putting into place a defensive policy by protecting in all simplicity their borders.
On the eve of war, two great defense lines crossed the continent. They were the fruit of diametrically opposed military doctrines. On the French side, the Maginot Line. With its 150 forts situated at strategic points, it was a thin but extremely solid defense line. Each region was given its outposts, placed a few kilometers in front of the line at strategic crossroads.
So the fortified houses and outposts positioned at crossroads were to slow down the enemy, but above all, to give the alert. This is where the line's full strength of bunkers, forts and turrets was put in place, and it was these constructions whose role it was to assure the defences along the main line of resistance. It was really very powerful.
The strategy was the same as that employed at Verdun. The French hoped the enemy would wear itself out in its attempts to break through the reinforced concrete. Then the French army would attack the exhausted army to win victory. there remained parts of the line that were more lightly defended, notably the 620-kilometer border with Belgium.
Die Vorstellung ist, dass man dann sozusagen die
The plan was that the stretches between the fortified regions would be defended by the regular army, which would be deployed as soon as a threat emerged.
Bedrohung gegeben ist.
On the German side, the bunkers were placed at regular intervals along the whole length of the border. The strategy was that of defense in depth. The Siegfried Line was, in fact, made up of several lines of obstacles, which the enemy would have to cross one by one. To start with, the famous anti-tank line called the Dragon's Teeth.
Once a tank was stuck in the Dragon's Teeth, it necessarily found itself raised up in such a way as to expose its caterpillar tracks. This made it easy to fire on and destroy.
The Germans intended to use this first position to disorganize an attack. It was the second position a few kilometers behind that they really intended to defend.
The Dragon's Teeth line was only a first obstacle. It was followed by a line of landmines, then barbed wire, then trenches, before arriving at the bunkers where the soldiers were posted.
Derrière tout cela, vous avez
And behind all of that, you had a third position made up of artillery and reserve troops who were there to launch counterattacks, but who were also a possible last line of last-ditch defense.
l'ultime défense.
The Siegfried Line had one particularity: the anti-aircraft defense line situated 20 kilometers behind the principal defense line.
Das ist also etwas absolut
Incorporating anti-aircraft defense in a fortification system was unique. The Maginot Line, on the other hand, had no such integrated anti-aircraft defense.
Festungswerke.
Fortified zones that were narrow but extremely solid on the French side versus a continuous system of lines in depth on the German side. Two fortification ideas, designed and built by talented engineers, faced each other at the eve of the Second World War. How would they stand the shock of war? September 1st, 1939. Hitler launched his attack against Poland with his tank and fighter plane armada. In less than 5 weeks, the country was defeated. Poland's allies, Britain and France, declared war on Hitler, and on the 9th of September, the French army even attempted an offensive in the Saar. For the first time, soldiers discovered the Siegfried Line.
There is no plan for an attack into Germany. They don't feel they're organized enough. French units haven't had their tanks for more than 2 months. There just simply is not the organization there to launch a large-scale offensive.
The attack was a fiasco. Frightened by a line of exploding mines, the French withdrew after 2 weeks of timid combat. The Nazi propaganda films had had their effect. The Siegfried Line inspired fear.
Wenn die Franzosen an die Maginot
If the French believe in their Maginot Line, they must necessarily think that the Siegfried Line, too, is a military obstacle that can only be overcome at the price of considerable human and material sacrifice.
Teil 1939-40 zum
And this belief would be fatal to them in 1939-1940. The French do not realize that this line is not very solid. Personally, I have little esteem for the military effectiveness of the Siegfried Line.
La ligne Siegfried.
The Siegfried Line was not well manned by the Germans. If we'd forced it, we could have got through.
Auch da wieder der fehlende, die fehlende
Again,
Bereitschaft, wirklich zu kämpfen und
You could
natürlich
see
auch
the
die
lack of
fehlende
will to
Bereitschaft,
fight,
da ein Operationsplan
to develop a serious attack plan for piercing the German defense line.
Westwall plant und die große Tragik
And the great tragedy of this period was that here was a real opportunity for ending the Second World
im
War.
Zweiten Weltkrieg zu beenden.
Overawed by the Siegfried Line, the French army withdrew. Ushering in the period known as the Phony War. Mobilized, the two armies observed each other face to face, each behind its line. The Wehrmacht used this time to prepare for what was to follow, the Western campaign whose centerpiece had to be victory against France. The soldiers carried out target practice on the Czechoslovak line that was now inside German territory.
Dann wissen die natürlich auch genau, wie das geht.
And of course, that enabled them to learn exactly how to approach these fortifications in terms of distance and strike power.
Und fängt dann an zu schießen außerhalb der
With the famous 8.8 gun, they simply bombarded the walls to see what would happen.
bei diesen Beschuss
This enabled the Germans to accumulate a lot of knowledge.
Erfahrungen.
On the 10th of May 1940 came the baptism of fire. The Wehrmacht prepared to attack the Belgian fortifications. The soldiers were equipped with a new and revolutionary weapon, the shaped charge, developed in the 1930s.
Inside a shaped charge, you always have a pointed device, but inside you have an inverted cone. And when the explosive is detonated, this inverted cone turns into a dart that will, thanks to its force, penetrate armor plating.
New weapons, such as the shaped charge, announced the beginning of the end for bunkers made of concrete and cupolas made of steel. The Belgian forts were taken in less than a day.
Also durch Sturzkampfbomber, durch die 8.8 Flak.
Confronted by modern warfare with its Stukas, powerful artillery such as the 8.8, and modern projectiles like the shaped charge, even the most solid fortifications proved powerless.
Im Grunde genommen der modernen Kriegführung nicht mehr gewachsen.
But the Maginot Line represented a very different challenge. Its 6-meter-thick reinforced concrete walls and its special security features prevented the Germans using the same methods they'd applied against the Belgian forts.
Try to neutralize a French fortress's artillery and you will quickly find yourself in front of a pit cutting off your approach. And even if you manage to get into the pit, you're going to get hit by a grenade hurled at you out of an opening designed for that purpose, and you will be sprayed with machine gun fire.
The Germans knew they needed to find another solution. On the order of the Führer, the best specialists were ordered to apply themselves to that task.
The German generals asked the steel foundries to produce cannon to pierce the Maginot Line. That means that they understood the force of the Maginot Line.
The result of their efforts? A gigantic 800mm caliber cannon. 32 meters long, it weighed 1,350 tons. To move it required mounting it on a train. It was the most powerful gun ever built.
But at the same time, it required thousands of people to make this gun and a number of trains to transport it. It would have been necessary to build a station with no fewer than 4 railway lines in order to install this gun. It was a gigantic investment, and finally the Germans decided against using this gun to attack the Maginot Line.
Literally indestructible, the Germans gave up the idea of attacking the Maginot Line head-on. What solution would the Germans be able to find? The only way to beat it was to go around it, and that is exactly what they would do. With its tank armada, the Wehrmacht attempted a breakthrough in the lightly fortified region of the Ardennes.
So the tanks will move forward quickly, they'll bypass opposition. The only way to defend against that is defensive depth. Part of the problem with the French anti-tank defence is it's not in depth, it's simply strung out in a line. So if you break through any point in that line, then there's nothing left to stop the armoured formations.
Fighting also broke out along the Maginot Line. The Wehrmacht's objective was to take the forts whatever the cost. In their bunkers, the men defended themselves under enemy fire.
The Schönenburg fortress was the most heavily bombarded fort on the entire Maginot Line. It took over 3,000 hits from bombs and shells. Not one weapon was neutralized, and among the entire crew of 630 men, there were only 2 killed and 15 injured.
And even the attempts to attack the fortifications from behind were unsuccessful for the Wehrmacht. It was then that the Germans discovered the French eclipse turrets capable of firing at 360 degrees. The Maginot Line's forts proved to be quite simply invincible.
pas la ligne Maginot qui est responsable des défaites de 40.
It wasn't the Maginot Line that was responsible for the defeat in 1940. It was the French command that, frankly, exploited it very badly. It was a magnificent instrument of defense put into the service of a deeply faulty plan of war.
Qui est complètement défaillante.
While the Maginot Line held, the French troops failed to repulse the German advance. Even though the French possessed in total more tanks than the Wehrmacht, their design and the way they were used were incompatible with the rapid war of movement that the Germans imposed.
Their idea of a battle is a methodical battle which is planned, it moves step by step, it moves slowly, very rigid maneuvers, and if you like, underpinning this rigidity is the Maginot Line. If you'd replace the French commanders with, say, German commanders in May 1940, they would have made, I think, a better job of the battle.
The Wehrmacht needed little more than 3 weeks to get to the Atlantic coast. When France signed the armistice on the 22nd of June 1940, the soldiers on the Maginot Line were still fighting in their bunkers, unconquered.
The forts defended themselves from attacks from behind when they were encircled and didn't surrender. The armistice came into effect on the night of 24th to 25th of June 1940, and it wasn't until the 1st and 2nd of July that the crews emerged from their Maginot Line forts on the order of the French, flying the tricolour. The Germans presented them with honours, just as the Italians did in the Alps.
The 22,000 men of the Maginot Line joined the ranks of the prisoners of war for 5 long years. As for the forts, they fell into the hands of the Germans. Like tourists, the conquerors had photographs taken of themselves with their impressive war booty. Later on, certain forts were converted into underground factories.
There were German engine manufacturers, whose names we won't mention, bomb makers and precision instrument makers who moved into some of the Maginot Line forts, which protected them from bombardment. So some German industrial products were manufactured on the French Maginot Line.
As for the German Siegfried Line, it hadn't received a single shot. Far from the fighting, it had proved more useful than the Maginot Line. Transformed into a propaganda tool, it had dissuaded the French from invading Germany and possibly even putting an end to the war. In June 1940, the Reich's borders changed. The Siegfried Line became a useless military relic in the middle of nowhere.
And the Siegfried Line fell into a deep sleep, like Sleeping Beauty. Certain buildings disappeared completely in the undergrowth.
Ja, man montiert die Waffen, die man entnehmen kann, aus.
The guns were dismantled. Everything in the bunkers that could be dismantled was dismantled and reinstalled on the Atlantic Wall. The Siegfried Line was decommissioned. It was no longer used at all. Farmers even covered the dragon's teeth so they could roll over them with their tractors and stop doing kilometers and kilometers of detours.
Und so weiter. Der spielt erstmal gar keine Rolle mehr.
But the Siegfried Line hadn't said its last word. The last rampart of the Reich, it was finally going to serve for real this time against Allied troops. 1944. After 4 years of war, Adolf Hitler's Reich was in trouble. In the east, the Red Army was rapidly advancing towards Berlin. On the other side, in England, an immense army of more than 1 million men was getting ready to land on Normandy beaches. For the German staff, the moment had come to mobilize all available resources. It was then that Hitler remembered the Siegfried Line. Left to fall into disrepair for nearly 4 years, it was in a sorry state. But that was of little consequence. It had to be the Reich's last rampart.
All of a sudden, it was a remake of 1938. Nearly 500,000 people were sent to work on the Siegfried Line. Only this time, it wasn't skilled workers, but women, children, forced labourers and prisoners of war who were asked to dig trenches. Because they weren't specialists, they made mistakes. Sometimes they dug in the wrong places.
falschen Stelle oder einer falschen Ausführung, aber es ist gegraben worden ohne Ende.
Und man bemüht sich eben auch, wieder Waffen in den
The attempt was made to rearm the bunkers, but it didn't work because armaments had evolved during the years of war. The standard German machine gun, the MG42, was bigger and no longer fitted into the bunker gun ports.
Just over 6 weeks after the Normandy landing, the Allies liberated Paris. They were now dangerously close to the German border. To defend themselves, the Wehrmacht soldiers threw everything they had into the battle. Positioned in the Maginot Line bunkers, they tried to repulse the advancing Allies. But it was wasted effort for these soldiers who didn't know how to operate them.
When the French soldiers learned in 1940 that they'd been surrendered to the enemy, they burnt all the material they had, including all the maps in their possession, those for observation, artillery and telephone systems. The Germans paid no attention.
The Germans have lost the war by this stage, and the Allies are going to win. It's just a question of how quickly. You have to bear in mind that Germany is now using, younger boys. The Volkssturm is starting to be mobilized, so it's reaching the limits of its manpower.
At the end of summer 1944, the American army was at the gates of the Third Reich, ready to launch the final offensive against its last rampart, the Siegfried Line. Before throwing its soldiers into the battle, the American staff decided to show them films to explain what was awaiting them. An extremely bad idea.
In einem dieser Filme kommt genau diese...
The American army showed its soldiers a German propaganda film in which you can see a gigantic German bunker that didn't exist on the Siegfried Line.
gigantisch ausgebaut scheint, während ihre Soldaten auf den Westwall zumarschieren. Und das heißt also...
This gives the impression to these soldiers, who know they're going to have to fight on the border, that they are about to confront miracle weapons and battle against fortifications that are insurmountable.
Wunderwaffen, da gibt's Bunker, da gibt's Festungssysteme. Da werden wir noch mal richtig kämpfen müssen.
Die Wehrmacht hat natürlich...
Despite their defeats, the Wehrmacht enjoyed, even at the end of the war, a lot of prestige. Everyone knew that the Germans would be dangerous to the very end. And the German army was indeed well trained and knew how to best exploit even a weakly fortified defense line.
On the other side of the border, the Wehrmacht soldiers waited, ready, in the Siegfried Line bunkers. Strategically, the situation was to their advantage. The German front could now be supplied directly from the Reich, while the American supply lines had lengthened. Even if the bunkers were ill-adapted for the new style of army, they nevertheless allowed the German soldiers to take shelter while the Americans were out in the open.
Das Telefonnetz funktioniert noch.
The telephone lines were still intact.
Und da gibt's sogar im Wald gibt es sozusagen...
They could connect telephones, which even worked in the forest. So the Germans still had a good communications network. This gave them a big advantage.
Das spielt eine gewisse Rolle.
The battle on the German frontier would be the bloodiest of the Western Front. The armies clashed in the towns, but also in the forests, which were extremely dense everywhere the Americans wanted to breach the Siegfried Line. Every 15 days, fresh troops were sent in as reinforcements. It took the American troops 5 months to penetrate the Reich's border. The Siegfried Line could not prevent the defeat of the Third Reich, but it allowed this murderous regime to prolong its demise with no regard for the toll this took on human lives. The match between the Maginot Line and the Siegfried Line ended in a goalless draw. Designed and built according to diametrically opposed military doctrines, neither one nor the other was able to save its country from debacle. With new weapons, such as the shaped charge and the massive use of air power, modern warfare had made these fortresses ineffective and obsolete. The Second World War would be the last fortified line war on the continent of Europe.